Good afternoon. I'm John Carlson here with the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I am delighted to welcome you to this, our first event of the spring semester. Happy New Year. It's our first event of 2021. Yay. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that we've got an event coming up next week. It's a conversation with the Yale historian David Blight entitled, Are We One Country or Two? And it's going to be a really, really scintillating conversation. He's been writing a lot in the and giving a lot of interviews, has an op-ed in the New York Times. I really encourage you to sign up for that event and to check it out on our website. Today's event is part of our ongoing series, Laid Bare: Vulnerabilities and Vitalities at the Nexus of Religion, Science, and Technology. This series takes up questions about the way that the COVID pandemic has really laid bare cares, concerns, contradictions involving a number of social inequalities, particularly health and healthcare and technology. These are not new issues, of course, but the pandemic has really brought them to the fore. It's exposed vulnerabilities within our communities and our relationships within those communities, and also expose some remarkable vitalities and opportunities for reimagining those relationships. So that's what we're here to do today. One thing that the pandemic has particularly impressed upon us quite urgently is the need to think in new ways about our relationship with the environment. And that's the focus of today's program, entitled Laid Bare: Sacred Earth. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you today our moderator, Craig Calhoun. He is University Professor of Social Sciences at Arizona State University, an eminent academic and scholar, has written innumerable books, and is just an incredible addition to our university. He was, before coming to ASU, a director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, and also president of the Social Science Research Council, a leading social theorist, comparative historian, and he has a new forthcoming book from Harvard Press called Degenerations of Democracy. So we wait with anticipation for that arrival. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Calhoun. Thank you all again for joining us, and over to you, Craig.
John, thanks for that introduction. It was very generous, but what's really important is our panelists, not me. So let me just introduce the project and our guests today. The Laid Bare series asks how events help us see deeper things that are going on, the COVID crisis being a case in point. And today's conversation is part of the project Beyond Secularization: Religion, Science, and Technology in Public Life. This is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust and housed, as you know well, John, in the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. This project calls into question and seeks to make sense of the deeply held modern belief that science and technology are not only secular, but secularizing, and that secularization is somehow the sure road to human and planetary progress. Now for today's conversation partners. First, Mary Evelyn Tucker, our guest, is with us from the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, which she co-directs and where she teaches in a master's program jointly with the School of Environment and the Divinity School. With John Grimm, she organized 10 conferences on world religions and ecology at Harvard. They were series editors for the 10 resulting volumes from Harvard. She's also co-edited and written a variety of other books: Confucianism and Ecology, Buddhism and Ecology, Hinduism and Ecology, Ecology and Religion. She edited Thomas Berry's selected writings and published a biography of Thomas Berry. With Brian Thomas Swim, she wrote Journey of the Universe and was the executive producer of the Emmy award-winning Journey film that followed from this and aired on PBS. She served on the International Earth Charter Drafting Committee and was a member of the Earth Charter International Council. Our second speaker is our own Hava Tirosh-Samuelson, Regents Professor of History and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at ASU, also the Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism. She writes on Jewish intellectual history, religion, science, and technology, and religion and ecology. Through her interdisciplinary research, she seeks to create bridges between intellectual disciplines, religious traditions, religious and secular outlooks, and gendered perspectives. Among her publications are Judaism and Ecology, Created World and Revealed Word, Happiness in Pre-Modern Judaism, Virtue, Knowledge, and Well-Being, and Religion and Environment, The Case of Judaism. She is also one of the principal investigators of the project of which this Laid Bare series is part, Beyond Secularization, together with Professor Ben Hurlbut and Professor Gaiman Bennett, all of ASU. So enough introductions. Mary Evelyn, we're going to start with you, and our main goal is to give you the chance to give your views or think aloud about a series of issues, and then Hava will engage the same issues, possibly responding to you, possibly simply responding to the original question that brought them out. So, first question. The pandemic has challenged humanity in lots of ways, from identifying simply what is going on, to taking public health measures to limit transmission, to developing and distributing vaccines. We've done better and we've done worse at some of these things, but the pandemic has also exposed, laid bare, underlying social realities like inequalities, inadequate institutions, and political polarization. What do you think are the most significant of these not narrowly biomedical issues? Mary Evelyn?
Well, thank you, Craig, and thank you, Hava, a long-term colleague. I think these are incredibly important questions, and I would just say, I think what's visible are the exposed inequities, for sure, that the pandemic and climate change has exposed around the world. But I wanted to pick up the point of the fundamental inadequacies of our institutions. And I think you know this well, Craig. But I would say it's across the board, isn't it? I mean, clearly our political institutions, we don't have a functional democracy. And we saw the consequences of that over the last 4 years deteriorating before our eyes. But in terms of society and social ethics, we also are lacking because we've elevated the individual liberties over a common good. And so freedom over fairness, and we can go on and on. But this is where the Enlightenment era brought forward democratic principles and liberties, but these need to be reconfigured. They need to be rethought. So these institutions that we've held up for so long are not functioning properly. And that goes for certainly healthcare, we can say over and over again right before our eyes, but economics as well. It's gone to profit over people based on market capitalism without any sense of constraint. My father was a corporate lawyer, but it was all about restraint and limits and so on. And those have been wiped off. And economic growth without limits is the mantra. And this has led ecologically to ravaged ecosystems, a complete disaster from all the UN reports and so on. And I think we know that very well. But if we have economic profit over social good, and we have the goal of wealth over well-being, we are in a very serious state of affairs. So I would just answer that first question in that way. And
sadly, I agree with you completely. And I think we are in a very serious state of affairs. So how can religion help us? But also, does religion and actual practices in different religions share some of the responsibility for the state of affairs we're in?
Yes, great question. Well, I think what is needed, and I do think religions bear responsibility and they also have potential answers. And that's what we need to evoke, don't we? Not only on this webinar, but going forward. Because this is fundamentally a values change that we're in the midst of. As I just indicated, some of the great Enlightenment values need to be rethought. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Well, it's all life. It's liberty that has responsibility at its core. It has a sense of the pursuit of happiness, not just for wealth and luxury, as we've seen over the last 4 years as the American dream gone mad. But I think this sense of values also needs to be contextualized within worldviews. All of this comes out of ideologies, if you will, belief systems that are very deep. They need to be identified and they need to be reconfigured. So we need, and I think you have said this, Craig, but we need solidarity amongst human, and we need kinship in the more than human world, for sure. So I think we can talk about 2 ways that religions can respond here. There's the practical and there's principles. Because everybody wants to know the practical. We're pragmatist Americans at heart, and so on. But we've got to keep these together, the principles and the practical. But I do think religions have compassion at their core, and therefore they have been leaders in terms of aid. And that means medical aid. 22% of the hospitals across this country are religious-based hospitals, and so on. The relief systems for climate disasters have been led by all kinds of religious organizations. The divestment movement of $14 trillion now, at least 25% is from religious communities, and so on. And then this whole notion of tikkun olam, of healing of the earth, of planting trees, and so on. Tomorrow, many people are celebrating the Festival of Trees in the Jewish tradition. How marvelous. So I think that's the part of the practical side that can very much go forward. Then coming back to the principles, we need clearly, and we know this, but an expanded environmental ethics. We need this sensibility that Thomas Berry spoke about, a communion of subjects, that there's subjectivity, there's interiority in the whole Earth community. Look at the title of this. Unbelievable, even a few years ago, to have a title in a secular university, Sacred Earth. This is part of the shift that this series represents. So it's beyond anthropocentrism, and yet holding up the role of the human. How does biocentrism fit into that, and so on. But if 85% of the world's people are still religiously identified, there's a great deal of work to do in reconfiguring these principles and the practical actions that come out of them.
All right, great. Well, mention of Tikkun Olam is a sort of good segue for turning to Hava and asking Hava similar questions. How is politics part of something bigger? How does religion matter? And what are the most important things going on outside the narrowly biomedical during the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Craig, and it's wonderful to share this event with Mary Evelyn. Since we have been doing similar work, actually, I owe my work on religion and ecology to Mary Evelyn, because you started it all 20, I don't know how many years ago, about 25 years ago. So I'm going to say very similar things. It's going to be kind of reflecting in the same vein. I would start by saying that the problem that we have is originally a social problem. Social ills are manifested not only in human domination, in human exploitation and oppression of other humans, but also in the domination and exploitation of the Earth's resources. So I would like us to make clear that social inequality is also, or social injustice is environmental injustice. And the pandemic has brought it up to the fore. So let's put the word justice kind of on the table and be sure that during our conversation, we're going to respond or reflect on it. The second word I would like to put on the table is the word care. I think that what the pandemic has exposed is the lack of care in our society. So on the one hand, our doctors, our nurses, our health teams are doing marvelous work attending to people who suffer from COVID and everything else. They definitely are engaged in heroic conduct, and they have the capacity to take care of and to care for the sick, the infirm, and the aged. But our society as a whole lacks a caring concern. So what we really have a deficit of care. And what we need to do is to make our society a more caring society. So a caring society should not have a situation in which there are food insecurities. A caring society should not have a situation in which it's unsafe to drink water in certain places. A caring society should not have air pollution. So I think that what we need to do is to make care the focus of our social life. And that means that any kind of behavior that is undermining care, any kind of greedy, exploitative behavior is simply unacceptable. So religion, I think, very much along the lines of Mary Evelyn, religion always helps us or compels us to think about the big picture, to look at the deepest, most profound issues that being human forces us to think about. The meaning of life, the purpose of life, our duties to humans and to non-humans. So I don't think that we can think about our ecological or environmental challenges without bringing religion to the forefront. And in many ways, the Abrahamic traditions especially force us to really take the right approach, and the right approach is respect. It's the sense of wonder, the sense of awe, and the profound commitment to care. So I can go on, elaborate on that if you have time, but tell me if you want to ask another question or where you wanted me to stop right here.
Well, let's introduce another dimension. You brought in justice and care both in this. What about community? And I'd like to hear from Mary Evelyn and from you, Hava, about whether this matters as a theme of its own, community among all people, community between people and the rest of life, and thus not just individual orientations to respect or care, but community, a collective orientation. Is that part of the religious discussion that's crucial here? Mary Evelyn?
I think it is, Craig. And I know that you've linked it also with cooperation, and we can't have cooperation without community, right? It seems so obvious on the one hand, but that's why this rethinking of even a declaration of independence towards a declaration of interdependence. And that's what the Earth Charter is. That was a 10-year process that came out of the Rio Conference in '92. It was trying to reassess economics and the environment. And it said, we need principles to do this. And Gorbachev and Maurice Strong led the action there. I was part of the drafting committee, but it was an incredibly intense effort of people from all over the international community for that period of time. It was one of the most vetted documents that we have of civil society. And those principles, again, would go towards hyper-individualism, has left us not only lonely personally, but with fragmented societies, and as Hava's just pointed out, not caring societies. And the difficulty is to name that and rethink it. I said before, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness have to be rethought, and we can't say that enough. What is an Earth community? What is a liberty that actually has a social contract at its core to say we have obligations and responsibilities? And the Confucian perspective on the Declaration of Human Rights, incidentally, insisted on having not only the rights, but the responsibilities in that document. So even the pursuit of happiness, what is a common goal? So let me just give a couple examples, about, of course, the golden rule is in many of the traditions, love your neighbor as yourself. The Confucian tradition has that and so on. But as you've indicated, it's a broader sense of neighbor, isn't it? It certainly is neighbor to the rest of the world. It certainly is neighbor to future generations. If Native peoples, the Haudenosaunee people, talk about responsibility for 7 generations, our youth movement is saying, let's have responsibility for just the next generation here. But I want to say something about that care, compassion, concern for neighbors beyond. At the heart of this, I think, for religion is the challenge that over the last 60 years has emerged on interreligious dialogue. And that is respect tolerance, understanding of various religions. And we have to be reminded that we have made progress, even though there's a lot of sad, bad news there. But you know, in the 60s, the Catholic Church, it was changed by Vatican II, but it had the doctrine of no truth in other religions, that this was the way towards salvation. So other traditions have had that. And especially, I have to say, Western traditions have had more of a sense of exclusive claims to truth. East Asian traditions are not perfect. South Asian traditions aren't perfect, but they don't have that same sensibility of my way or the highway. Let me just conclude about, and so what I'm suggesting there is interreligious dialogue will be a base for this tremendous sense of community extended around the planet. And then the notion of cooperation can flow from that, because we're trying to talk about the flourishing of the Earth community for your children, our students, and all future generations. And I think, just to take one idea from Martin Buber, one of the great Jewish thinkers that's known around the world, the I-thou idea, and how much traction that has had, that people are not objects, they're subjects in terms of relationality. And that is the sensibility that I think we can increase. We can do it with mutual aid societies, like Kropotkin had the idea. And what are mutual aid societies? What is a fire department? What is a police department? And what are religious communities if they are not mutual aid societies, to say that the community can work for a common good? So I'll leave it at that for now.
So I love the idea of community as dialogical relationships, not conformity to some fixed standard. And I'm resisting the impulse to go off into a discussion of whether, given the last year, it's easy for us to think of police as mutual aid societies these days. But let me ask Hava for her thoughts about community among people and the community of life as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. I would like, it's kind of interesting because, of course, the Jewish tradition is all about community. You simply cannot be a Jew alone. So in that sense, it's not a coincidence that dialogical philosophy has been, or what we call philosophy of encounter, has been promoted by Jewish thinkers such as Martin Buber. He's not the only one. You simply need other people to be a full human being. But beyond that, you also need, you cannot flourish alone. So the notion of flourishing, which I actually take to be the main insights of the Aristotelian tradition. So you cannot think about flourishing without thinking about the well-being of the environment itself and everything that lives on the environment. So human beings cannot flourish alone. There's no such thing. We are always part of an ecosystem, both environmental and social ecosystem. And once we begin to appreciate that, then we take the notion of interdependence and interconnectedness and relationality, we take it for granted. So the whole notion of an individual who is self-enclosed, kind of a thought that thinks itself, simply does not exist. It's not reality. So in that sense, we have to let go of one of the Enlightenment ideals, especially when it's misunderstood, and focus more, in my view, the inspiration should come from the Aristotelian tradition, which has indeed inspired medieval Judaism, medieval Islam, medieval Christianity, and now has been recovered again in what we call virtue ethics. So that would be another word that I would like us to kind of think about, to what extent the virtue traditions of the world, both East and West, can help us think about the right attitude toward the natural world. And I definitely believe that virtue is relevant to environmentalism. We need to cultivate the right disposition, the right character traits of people who will care about the environment. Everything begins with caring. If you don't care, we don't start with caring about, then we cannot care for and we cannot take care of. So we need to care, and caring begins with a whole posture of humility, of modesty, of self-control, of course, compassion. So that's kind of the ideal. That I think what education should be all about, cultivating the morally virtuous person who cares about the environment. That to me is the task for the 21st century moral education. So I'll stop with that, but it's obvious that that kind of personality trait or personality type is cooperative, is not selfish, is not greedy, is not self-centered, and so forth and so on. So there is room for education in that regard.
Sounds to me like there's room for improvement too. I wanted a moment to ask about how religion may help us feel empowered to deal with these things, but I want to first ask a different question, which is, we've been talking about community care, relationality, and all of this. How is our thinking about ourselves in these relations, in these communities, in the world, as caring people, challenged by technology and very large-scale global political economy, and the scale of modern life, which is, it seems for many people, not an I-thou scale, but a scale in which other people are at best very indirectly related to us, or distant, or not visible face to face. So how do we think about the relationship between this world of direct relationships we've been evoking and the kind of person we want to be in those relationships, and this larger, more indirect, more impersonal, more systemically governed technological world?
Well, I think great question, of course. And a lot of people, do go, I love the virtue ethics, and that's what Confucianism is all about. One of the things that attracted me to the self-cultivation idea and a common good. But I think what you're raising, Craig, is the sense there's structural change, not just individual change. And that is one of our deepest challenges, clearly, because of the alienation and personalism and so on that you just noted. But let me take a step back in this way. If we take a few issues of how change has happened and with religious influence, I'd like to take the nuclear treaty, for example. I mean, just today we know that the START treaty for non-proliferation has been renewed, thankfully, between US and Russia. But even more importantly, on January 22nd, just last week, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into effect. Now that started only 3 years ago in 2017 and was ratified in October of 2020. But that was work of thousands of people around the world, many peace activists, the Catholic worker tradition. I testified for one of the activist nuns in this regard. So I'm very sympathetic to these peace activists who have, against all odds, put forward a treaty that has gotten almost no news in the mainstream news, that was unpredictable, but with moral force, with religious commitment, and with hundreds of activists, thousands, this has taken place. Let me also say, as we know, the abolitionist movement rising up in England took the Quakers decades to say that slavery was morally wrong. Why? Because it was economically profitable. Does that sound familiar? Is that not an argument about oil and gas and fossil fuels? And the profit mentality here had to be disassembled to say something's morally wrong. And when a slave ship owner realized that himself, we get this amazing grace hymn, which is iconic, isn't it? Even at the inauguration, something changed, a conversion. But that was driven by religious moral sensibilities with persistence over time. The civil rights movement, we all know. I went to college in Washington, D.C., where Nancy Pelosi was ahead of me and so on. And when we saw the religious leaders, Martin Luther King, Heschel, Everett Gendler, the Jewish and Christian communities coming together, astounding how that created a fire of transformation. Before that, the worldview was segregation, separate but equal. No problem, because they're going to be equal over here, even if the conditions were not, because they weren't visible. the worldviews had to be broken down for abolition and slavery, and then civil rights and so on. And these sensibilities of change, I think, are part of the structural change that religions can enter into as movements, as communities, and individuals. I don't know if you want to take up the technical part of this question too.
If you want to add to it. Let me just stick in a comment, though. You mentioned the abolitionist movement, and I've long been struck by the shift that was brought about by thinking of slavery not just as an individual sin of slave owners, but as a collective national sin of a country that tolerated it.
Yes.
And I think some of the same thing has infused civil rights and other movements for change.
Yes, yes, I think that's such a great point. And I think then going to the other huge challenge that you've put before us, technology, right? And I sort of want to break it into two parts. One is the technology of social media, which is one of the most complex things that we are facing. Because if we have fake news prompted by Twitter and Facebook and all of this, we have some serious problems to deal with. But I would also say that, again, religious communities have some of the largest, most complex communication services around the world, and that has got to be utilized for genuine transformation and the moral good. The technologies and Social Dilemma, that film, by the way, of course, really makes clear the problems of social media. But if we take the various technologies, let me hold up, a few that are very positive, and that is alternative energy, which has escalated all over. And it's also clear that churches and synagogues are putting on solar, they're doing their carbon footprint, et cetera. Interfaith Power and Light has been very active in almost every state for these issues dealing with climate change and climate activism. So alternative energies are part of this moral force that's coming together for structural change. And let me just say, and I'll conclude here, so we need that for a carbon neutral society, these alternative energies and the support of it, but we also have to have some serious ethical consideration of geoengineering, which most scientists I know are already deeply concerned about, deeply disturbed about. And I can say that all kinds of funding is on the horizon, if not already embedded in institutions of higher learning. And I don't want to go into particulars here, but we need ethical boundaries. We need a sense of unintended consequences and a precautionary principle for the earth, for life systems, and for future generations. So I'll leave it at that regarding geoengineering.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, Hava, let me go over to you then about the same set of questions about scale and technology and how the personal connection relates to a sometimes impersonal world.
Yes, so I'm going to make a defense of the personal and the value-based as opposed to policy and of course, technology. Not that they're not important, but I really would like to start by reminding us that how shall I put it bluntly? Virtuous people can generate virtuous policies, not the other way around. The policy doesn't create the person creates the policy. So I think a lot of time, the position that both Mary Evelyn and I kind of promote get dismissed because, oh, well, that's the soft side, right? We need to talk about policy. We need to talk about investment. We need to talk about technological issue. And I would like to say, slow down. It's good people who do good things in the world. So what are the values that good people, especially religious people, can bring to the fore in terms of shaping the policy? Two values come to my mind, in addition to all the things I already mentioned. One is responsibility. When we put the commitment to responsibility up front and center, then the policy will follow. But if we don't think in terms of responsibility, responsibility for others, responsibility for future generation, then we really miss something. We are unable to respond to the challenges that come our way. The other point I think that we can remind ourselves about is hope. We need to think with hope in mind, and hope enables us to overcome the despair. The problems that we face are very, very deep and very, very profound, very challenges. But if we have hope, I think we position ourselves to deal with the problems better than if, for example, we just rely on technology. So now let me switch to the technological issue. I think that the role of religion is to remind the techno buffs or the techno optimists or the techno warriors that not everything has a technological solution. So it's not right to put all our faith in technology. Rather, a lot of time, as Mary Evelyn already mentioned, we have unintended consequences, but also which technology is okay, which is appropriate, which is not, how to think about it requires a whole set of values that technology itself does not produce. So it's the values that should run the technology, not the other way around. That would be my basic position. So we are entering a new era, the Anthropocene era, according to many geologists. Anthropocene means that everything is going to be controlled by humans. I think that's where religious people and religious traditions can challenge the challenges of challenge the assumptions of the Anthropocene discourse. Go slow. It's not that technology can solve it all. We are not going to be able to have a Garden of Eden on Earth just by technological solutions.
And I was hoping a carbon capture machine would solve all our problems. Hava, you've already started to answer this, but let me ask both of you a little more explicitly. One of the things that undermines action to try to create a better world is a feeling that it's futile. The pandemic has happened, it's going on, there's nothing we can do. Climate change, even more. How hopeless is it? Well, I can recycle bottles and cans, but does that even make a difference? Does religion help us achieve a sense of empowerment, of capacity to act? And then Hava, of course, mentioned hope. Mary Evelyn?
Well, great question. Again, the die is cast, as you suggest, that we can't do anything. And actually, why is this so important? Because this is about activating human energy. Between the two wars in Europe, existentialism arose and a range of other thought systems. But existentialism doesn't really answer the deep questions of human energy. And this is something that Teilhard de Chardin was very interested in. And he had this sense of the long-term evolutionary context, which I want to return to for a moment, because we see in our students this terrible dilemma between hope and despair. And I think despair is eating at the next generation and at many, many people. So let me just say, with modesty and with hope, the potential of religions is to activate human energy as it has over time, along with many other things. The arts, music, and so on do that as well brilliantly. Look at the poet at the inauguration, Amanda Gorham, who stole the show. So that activates human energy. But let me just name quickly 4 things that I think religions can contribute. One is, and we've touched on it, long-term and lasting change. These traditions have been the ones I study, especially in East Asia, here for thousands of years. And along with Judaism, some of the oldest traditions on the planet. So long-term, lasting, and efficacious change is important and is in their visibility. Now, it's also to be said, I agree, of course, with Hava's points about virtue ethics and so on, but let's come back to efficacious institutions for change. These two are traditions bound up with traditions, and they know, even awkwardly and sometimes Byzantinely, how to change. Vatican Council II exploded a medieval church into the modern world, and that's still being worked out. It takes 60 years to do that. But let me also say, between tradition and modernity, innovative change can and does happen. We know this in all the denominations of Judaism, for sure, and this is always being contested in all the religions. But let me just give one example of innovation that I think has tremendous possibility of fecundity, of yeast rising change. And that is this coming together that Hava also referred to of ecology and justice, of social issues and environmental issues. Now, I can say at our school at Yale, a school that's 130 years old, School of the Environment, has been very much concentrating on the environment. People were very secondary. Minority faculty only came this year. Think about that. The Divinity School, very much on the social and the human side. Environment is not in the horizon. Now, coming together, even though this was started in the early 80s by both the World Council of Churches and the Catholic Church, justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, trying to put this all together. But it didn't get the full traction until Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical, which is an extraordinary one, because it brings together cry of the earth, cry of the poor. This is Leonardo Boff, the leading theologian, liberation theologian from Brazil, who brought this together. And Thomas Berry said to him, Leonardo, you can't liberate people without the earth. So he did this book in 97, and here it appears in full form. And the next generation is picking this up and running with it, absolutely running with it. Environmental justice is the operative word. It took a long time to incubate, but it's here, and it's a transformative and hopeful sign, I think. And that's my last point, is that this encyclical calls for ecological conversion. There's this beautiful phrase that it comes under the door like a mist, like a fog, that it's coming into being, ecological conversion for an earth, the flourishing, as Hava says, of the earth community.
Fantastic. You've given us a summing up, Mary Evelyn. Let me turn to Hava, both with attention to that question about how religion helps us overcome a sense of futility, and with an opportunity to sum up some of her thoughts here before we turn to wider questions.
So I would just add the following things. First of all, we always start locally. No matter how big and global the problem is, the work has to be done locally. And that's on the local level is where we experience community. It's kind of nice to talk about the community of subjects all over the world, but really we live very locally, and each locality, each region has its own peculiarity. So that's the first point I would like to leave the audience with. The second point is we are positioned to really deepen the interfaith conversation or interreligious conversation about all those issues. And Mary Evelyn, indeed, we're all indebted to you since you kind of started the whole international movement of interfaith conversation about religion and ecology. And we need to continue with that. But we should also remember that there's a lot of shared ground between religious people and secular people. And we see it especially in environmental ethics, especially in environmental virtue ethics. So instead of keeping those silos apart or those traditions apart from each other, we need to do a lot more integration. In other words, I'm for interdisciplinarity, especially when it comes to environmental matters. Just to throw one teaser by way of thinking about it, the ethics of care, we should remember, is one major contribution of feminism to environmental thoughts. So feminist ethics of care has a lot in common with other secular forms of environmental ethics, as well as with religious ethics. So let's always work on what we have in common rather than what separates us. And the more we do that, I think the more capable we're going to be in addressing the needs of the present as well as the need of future generation.
Okay, that's brilliant. And let's work on what we have in common or where there are differences with the members of the audience. Sarah Lords is going to facilitate questions and answers from people who are using the online tools to make their comments. Sarah, you're muted. Sarah, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you for the great discussion. Attendees, if you would like to submit your questions through the Q&A function for the webinar, I will be scrolling through them and coalescing them into themes or asking them directly. And for those of you who are watching through YouTube, there's a little chat box just to the right of the video screen where you're also able to submit questions. So to kick us off, I would like to continue with the last theme that we were discussing, but perhaps two more disappointing results. So religion can be leveraged for human and ecological harm. We've seen that happen in a few examples. What thoughts do you have to offer on our orientation towards religion, especially when the outcome is disappointing to us when we think about ecological ethics? And Mary Evelyn, if we could start with you, that'd be excellent.
Well, I'm not completely sure of the fullness of the question. I think there's a lot behind it probably, but what I'm hearing is, the way I like to put it anyway, is religions have their problems and religions have their promise. And we really need to acknowledge that from the very beginning. Historically and at present, we see the contentiousness, the lack of tolerance that we're trying to counter with dialogical approaches to problems and to respect for other traditions. So I think there's no question that religions have not always contributed fully and not always contributed well. But I think right now, there's a moment that I think is emerging that we need to recognize. And I think people like Charles Taylor who have confronted the secularization argument, and Craig as well. Here's the issue. Science and religion have had their, not dialogical for the most part, coexistence, siloed, if you will. And that's what I see in academia and all the places that I've taught, including Berkeley and Harvard and Yale. Very siloed, huge disrespect for religion within secular academia and so on. So this is one of the fundamental problems that we have got to figure ways to open up that resistance. Now, why? Because the scientists themselves are almost desperate, realizing that facts alone do not communicate to many, many people, and they need values to do that. So facts and values being separated has been hugely problematic. Now, I'm saying empirical knowledge is very, very important. We respect it, we value it, but there are other ways of knowing, and that's what needs to be valued. Religious ways of knowing, artistic ways of knowing, indigenous ways of knowing, and so on. And by doing that, we can then repossess, if you will, we like to say retrieve, reevaluate, and reconstruct the elements of these traditions that have ecology and justice in them. And let me just conclude in a very practical way. We had a big meeting in December of faculty trying to think planetary solutions, okay? It was the largest meeting ever because you could do it through Zoom, so there are 300 faculty on this meeting. And one faculty member was arguing for reductionism and systems thinking. And I said, reductionism is necessary for empirical knowledge, but not sufficient. Let's just take the case of Hawaiian trans-Pacific voyages that were lost for hundreds of years and then have been recovered in modern times with no scientific instrumentation crossing the vastness of the ocean, 6,000 miles from Hawaii to the South Pacific. An incredible transfer of indigenous knowledge. Let's just put that into the mix among many examples of restoration projects, of rivers, of forests that indigenous peoples are now very much engaged in up and down the coast of our West Coast, California, and Washington, et cetera. So I just wanted to put that into the to mix from the question.
Excellent. Hava, do you have any thoughts to contribute?
Yeah, I would agree with the person who asked the question that religion could be doing something negative, especially vis-a-vis the environment. For example, a religious tradition that has over-spiritualizing tendencies in it could be a problem when it comes to environmental. or environmental concerns. So the response to that would be that the tradition also has other positive things. So it's not that it's one or the other, and we can never really generalize about any religious tradition. What we need to do is to use the word that Mary Evelyn already introduced, retrieve. It's all about how you interpret. It's all about what you emphasize. It's all about what you make available. So as long as we minimize or reinterpret or reconstruct some of the destructive elements in the tradition, we can move forward. But if we just say, oh, well, that's religion and we cannot do anything to it and we have to accept whatever we have inherited, that's not going to be sufficient. So to me, we need to minimize over spiritualizing tradition. We need to focus on embodiment and on physicality, as opposed to on asceticism. And we need to never forget the ethics of duty. We all have duties to the environment, to the world that God has created. And if we operate with this ethics of duty and recognize that it's not contradictory to ethics of virtue, rather they are complementary, then we can do a lot of good.
Absolutely, excellent. I would like to continue on that theme. So we've got a question from Anonymous and then also from LaDawn. And it starts off with acknowledging that there is a lack of public-minded ethics towards environmental policies, especially here in the US. But it also seems like a source of conflict is not just the individual versus the collective, the central versus the decentralized. It also is about tribalism, about an us and them. And so religion, which often exacerbates that rather than helps it heal, how do we overcome that tribalistic mentality internally and coherently within our communities?
Well, again, a great question. And I think, we are in the grips of a variety of fundamentalisms. We've got political fundamentalisms of nationalism gone mad, of self-exceptionalism of countries all over the world. And again, exacerbated over the last 4 years. But religious fundamentalism is its own particular brand. We have it in India, in Modi. We have it in Israel. We have it in this country, as we know. It is all over the world. And I think with a sympathetic eye, we can say modernity is so challenging that fundamentalism is kind of a protective cocoon to retreat to. I have the answers. My tradition is correct in every way. And therefore, the sensibility of opening the gateways, the floods that Hava has referred to, of compassion and of care are one way of breaking this down. And it's to say that your children, our children, there's no future without a shared future. How do we translate that into solidarity with other humans and to say, as the pandemic has demonstrated, human, animal, we're all humans and animals, but humans and the more than human world are one community. And I would say, if I might just quickly, Hava, I love your point about the local and community and so on, but I'm very inspired, actually, you see, by the sense of a Confucian sensibility that indigenous peoples have too, that the universe has gifted us with this life, this unfolding dynamic process, and that Earth systems have come out of it. Now you can take that scientifically and have, as you know, awe and wonder and beauty, but that humans are completing an extraordinarily complex system of life, 14 billion years old. That's why we did Journey of the Universe. So that's part of how we need to bring together science and religion in respecting these dimensions of life and life systems over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to answer, in a sense, a kind of a follow-up on what Mary Evelyn, but reminding us that tribalism can be addressed maybe by bringing self-criticism. It's not that religion doesn't have self-criticism or doesn't have the rational commitment. On the contrary, a good religion has it both. It has faith and reason. It has, right? So the more critical we are of ourselves first, the more we can loosen up those rigid boundaries that create that kind of dogmatic tribalism that people in kind of a herd mentality vote in a certain way rather than thinking, okay, what's really needed? What's really needed right now in order to deal with the problems that face us? So I would say self-criticism can go a long way, and that means that scientists and secularists who are committed to modernist science can very much be part of the conversation. There need not be a conflict between religion and science. They are complementary, not in conflict with each other.
I definitely agree. Craig, I was curious if you had any thoughts that you'd like to contribute to this question as well.
Well, let me segue with that into a sort of wrap up. So one point about this question is suggested a bit by what Hava said, but I'll put it another way. Whether we're talking about religion or we're talking about nations, we often act too much as though the issue is what we have received and not what we're going to make of it. And I think that trying to be better, trying to do better is crucial in each connection. As inheritors of religious faiths and traditions, we try to make them better. As members of nations, we don't just have bellicose relations with others. We ideally, at least, try to make our countries better. And so I think that impulse to self-improvement, which includes the self-critique that Hava talked about, and includes ideals, is important. This has been a great conversation. So thank you, Mary Evelyn, and thank you, Hava. Thanks to the questioners. Thanks to Sarah. We often hear as a sort of mantra in the contemporary world, just listen to the scientists, whether it's climate change or the pandemic, just listen to the scientists. And this is a big improvement on just listening to the politicians or just listening to the people who want to make money, but it's still only part of the story. And religion is also part of this larger conversation. And what we've heard here are several reasons to think of religion as part of the conversation, as bringing perspective into the conversation, not just the perspective of explicitly religious values, but of a longer time and a different sense of the whole, and bringing motivation for action and bringing hope. So I really am grateful for this conversation, which I think is an important part of our larger project of trying to think and understand the pandemic and similar events.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And towards that theme, trying to, consider religion as something to heal our country. We've got an upcoming event with David Blight. For those of you who are still on as participants, I've just posted the registration link for it. And it's entitled, Are We One Nation or Two? And it is going to bring in a Civil War historian to reflect on the insurgency at the Capitol, the inauguration, and sort of other issues that are going on in America today and how to heal division and polarization and bring reconciliation. So that event is February 3rd, and we'd absolutely love to see you. John, would you like to offer closing sentiments to some of our panelists?
My closing sentiments are only that I'm extremely grateful and illumined and feeling very enlightened and invigorated right now. Thank you so much for not only getting your arms around a really important set of problems, but really for proposing how it is we can adjust, take some specific stances, and embrace some practices and orientations that will help us move to a better place. So thank you very much. We need more. There's never too much of that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for joining us.
With that, we will conclude this webinar. It is recorded and will be available on our website at csrc.asu.edu/events. If you like talks like this, if you want to support the work that we're doing and making these themes and ideas available to the public, consider making a donation to the center at csrc.asu.edu/support. Thank you so much again, Craig and Hava and Mary Evelyn and John, and all of you for attending. And we look forward to seeing you digitally soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.